yes, I'm trying to tell you a ripping yarn. Yes, I, might be trying to rip your heart out and put it back together or whatever, the kind of like artistic thing. But the overall intellectual project is always about trying to destabilize the past.
I'm Nathan Maharaj, and this is Kobo in Conversation. My guest is Nate DiMeo. His podcast, The Memory Palace, is, look, I'm just going to speak on a personal level. It's one of my favorite things. Ostensibly, it's a history podcast, but history as vignettes, as short stories, as jewels carefully mined from a variety of sources and narrated in usually about 15 minutes. It's maybe the most literary of all history podcasts, so naturally, many of its episodes have come to be collected into a book and a star-studded audiobook called The Memory Palace. And it was such a delight to a longtime fan such as myself, and it's a real treat for all kinds of readers to discover now. Nate DiMeo, welcome to Kobo.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here.
We've subjected listeners now to my effusive fawning over the Memory Palace, but I got to ask you, how do you describe it?
Poorly, I feel like. I think that one of the issues with it's an ongoing issue for the show, and in certain respects for the book, is that the elevator pitch to me, which is that it is, short narrative essays, put to music or collected here in this book. Never sounded like something I myself would listen to or read. I am a lover of the past and of historical things, but I'm not that much of a history buff, I have to admit. I almost exclusively, when I am reading history, it is almost exclusively on the clock. But I am excited by and energized by and deeply moved by the past. And so, what is the Memory Palace? On some level, it is me as a writer using the past and the facts of the past and the figures of the past as raw material to explore the present, and not in the way that sort of like, hey, there was recently an election. Let's look back to a time in which two nations also bickered over nonsense or something like that. I was having a conversation one time with the woman who runs Radiotopia, which is the network that the podcast is a part of, and she is a poet, which makes her a great kind of collaborator as a creative person herself. And I was complaining to her one time about going to all of these different, podcast conferences and feeling sort of like a weirdo, feeling like an outlier, that they were, a bunch of documentarians and stuff. And that here I was focused on making my little beautiful things and worrying about whether something is wonderful enough and that sort of thing, and just feeling like a little bit of a misfit. And then she said, have you ever thought of yourself as a poet? And I said, no, that's, how pretentious is that? And then she said, think about it. And I was like, oh, shoot, I think you might be onto something. And I think that that's sort of true, because I think that, a poet who goes, for a walk in the woods and then, finds a pine cone that reminds them of their father or whatever, and then becomes a metaphor for, something about the human condition. I think that's ultimately what I'm doing with the past. I am looking, to the past in that same way to, find these people and find these connections that allow me to explore things in my own life. And so, a story about, I learned that there was once a very famous, artist who we now completely don't remember, who makes things in butter in the 19th century. And on the one hand, it's a cool factoid, and there's definitely some story in there. But what it means to me and what it allows me to do is to talk about, art and permanence, and whether the things, art and fame and the fleeting nature of fame and all sorts of things that I am interested in, become a part of that story. And, and that is a difficult thing to explain in an elevator.
As you've been promoting this book, you've spoken about where it all started and how the arc of your career brought you here. You were in some bands.
Sure.
You worked in public radio. There's no through line here that anyone could anticipate node by node. So I wonder where in your eclectic career arc and the general flow of life and just being a creative person,
Sure.
when did you realize that these tiny bits of history would be, your thing to present to the world?
I have really been attuned to the fact that when I would talk to people about the past, particularly when I first got into it,
Mhm.
like when I was sort of in my teens and 20s, when I first became really kind of fascinated thinking about my family's history, which is utterly ungripping to anyone but us. But just the ways that that especially living in the small city of Providence, Rhode Island, where I grew up and then spent a lot of my 20s, um, the ways that this kind of like palimpsest of time, that I'd be walking the same streets that my father walked, that his father walked. um, I was fascinated by that. And then in my early 20s, that kind of began to extend, to just historical stuff, to novels that touched on history, like books like Ragtime by E.L.
Mhm.
Doctorow, um, uh, and going to museums and going to historic home tours and stuff like that. I really just became fascinated by it. But I did find that um, I had a way of talking about it that people responded to,
Mm.
that there was something about storytelling, that like, hey, I went to this museum and this is what I found. I would kind of watch what would happen at the bar, when I would catch up with a friend,
So you mean literally
literally
talking about it?
talking
The
about it.
talking about it really was the inspiration.
The talking about it was the inspiration, like that, like, hey, I saw this thing and it really moved me, and let me try to move you too, which is the subtext of all that. Like, let me try to impress this, do something that is beyond, like, a very sort of male coded, like, well, actually, let me tell you some facts sort of thing, but like, let me share this thing that moved me because it moved me. Let me connect with you about this. And the through line is that I was doing that at one point, trying to do that through songs. I was doing that at one point, trying to do that through journalism. Like, hey, let me tell you the most interesting thing that I discovered about this thing when I went on this reporting trip. That I was carrying along this notion of like, let me make art, let me make something beautiful. That is very true to me, and ultimately I found that in practical terms, in terms of what the world might want to hear from me, that this was the thing that was most unique to me. This like strange sense of the past and the strange sort of understanding of memory, and this strange way I have of reflecting on history. Was the thing that was sort of most practically useful. That like, oh, people want some history content, but it was the thing that happened to be also be the most purely me, that I could find a comfort and pleasure and challenge in, toying with over and over and over again.
Had you realized you were good at this and just held that for years, or did realizing you were good at it turn very quickly into a podcast?
That's interesting. I think held it for years on some level. That as I sort of got better as a kind of writer, reporter, or in particularly as an editor of other reporters,
Mm.
sort of like really being able to like burrow down into like the story and all of that stuff. I kind of spent lot of other time sort of becoming good at the other aspects of what is ultimately podcasting in the form that I do it, of the getting comfortable on the mic
Mm.
and learning to write tight, through journalism, through editing other journalists. I really started to find that a lot of these kind of storytelling skills that were like frankly learned around like the kitchen table at my grandparents' house, where boy, do they know how to deliver a punchline. Boy, have they tightened this story over time. Boy, is the fact that it's short really useful. There's something, there's nothing better than I mean, there's two great types of stories. There's the stem winder, like the thing where the person's going on and on, but you never feel like they're not in control and that they're taking you somewhere. And then there's the quick, you're in and you're out. And I was fascinated by both and what made both work and what made both tick, and was kind of finding as I was, doing journalism, that some of those skills applied, that there was something about like cutting to the chase. And there was something about, really identifying what is the thing that is most important here? What is the thing that is funniest here? What is the context that you need to get this? And so while developing those skills in the back of my mind, as like a ambitious, younger person who like wanted his own thing and wanted to, make art that was like worthy and on par of the other types of art in other fields that I admired and loved, that I guess in the back of my head, it was like, well, I can't shake these, this kind of like passion for the past. And also, I just have a lot of respect for the person who works for a very long time at the single thing,
Mm.
that the person who does that same comic strip over and over again, the person who has been writing songs for decades. And I kind of wanted to like find something that would be that I could, ply a trade, something that was sort of like limited in scope, but that would be capacious enough that like I was not bored, that I was not writing the same jokes over and over again. That I was, in the way that Gary Trudeau, the guy who does Doonesbury, those characters like live and breathe forever. He's not just finding like another funny thing that like, the kids in the block that he writes about can do.
Mm.
And yeah, at some point I really did find that in the Memory Palace, in that not only did I find something that kind of could eventually work kind of professionally, moreover, I had found something that could kind of be the work of my life, which was a shocking thing. I didn't know that was something I wanted, but it has turned out to be so. That when I sat down to write this book and compile some favorite stories that would work best on the page, and write some new stories and try to figure out like what's a story for the book that isn't a story for the podcast. And then probably most importantly, really taking the time to write some memoir in the book, which is something that my listeners had never encountered before. In writing that and compiling these stories, I had two thoughts. The process kind of began with my editor. I compiled a document that was called Story Triage, where I went through the 200 something episodes and was like, this one's great. This one doesn't work so well without the sound. This one,
Mm.
boy, the music does a lot of work in this one. And then next thing I know, I have like 130 stories that I'm sending her. And one of the things that I learned through reading those stories all at once was, boy, this person's weird. The person that is choosing these stories, the person that is writing these stories, has a very specific, hard to pin down, uh, you know, perspective that is interesting, frankly. That is worth, that I think that if I were listening to this for all this time, I would probably have questions about me, and questions about what actually is the Memory Palace. And, I wanted to turn in that memoir section to kind of like talk a little bit about where my fascination with the past comes from, where this particularly strange lens that I am looking at the past through, where that got kind of ground and sharpened.
Mm. When you signed that book deal and
Hmm.
you knew that you were going to have to undertake this task of triage,
Sure.
what was the first story that you knew you'd put in the book?
Well, I mean, it's I did used to be in bands. We were, none that were memorable to but all but a small handful of people. But boy, did I love making a set list. I love thinking about, I love a playlist. I love, thinking about order and drawing people through an experience, like whether it is a girl in 1998 that I'm trying to charm through some collection of songs, or a friend who I was like, hey, I know you're driving up to San Francisco, like here's an hour and a half of your drive.
Mm.
Or being in a band and being like, okay, we're going to open up with this one that builds slowly, and then we're going to hit him with something that's like fast, and then we're going to bring it down. Like, I love that. I love that kind of act of curation through time and space. And so that was the delight of the challenge of how can I create a book that will function a little bit, like that will feel a little bit random, because the show feels a little bit random. You don't,
Yeah.
it bounces around through time, week to week. It bounces around in vibe week to week. And I wanted the book to feel that way. I want it to feel like a cabinet of wonders. Like years ago when I was originally conceiving the show, one of the ideas was that maybe part of this should even have like a fictional, like maybe there should be an imaginary museum, like where like I am the docent of this museum that's like run by some eccentric billionaire. And I want a little bit of that spirit of like, of that you don't know where it's going to take you, but there is also this kind of invisible hand. And in doing so, I also thought about the reader in the bookstore that is browsing while their spouse is getting that gift wrap for their nephew or whatever. That are just picking up this book because it looks pretty on the shelf, that it looks pretty on the table, and flips to the first couple pages and maybe reads a little bit of the introduction. So the introduction is important. So let me make sure I sell myself there and explain what I'm doing. But I wanted a story that that caught people immediately, that you could read, because you can many of these stories in just a couple of minutes, while waiting for that present to be wrapped. And I wanted something that would grab you immediately, something that kind of like was a declaration of purpose and something that was good. And so, yeah, I always kind of knew that this story, Distance, that I was about to say what it's about, but like honestly, like it works because it's surprising.
Yeah.
And to me, that is the essence of the Memory Palace, is this thing that you do not know you're going to be fascinated with, and that you are, and that within just a brief time, not only are you like, oh, whoa, that's cool. And then at the end you are elated or you are devastated or something in this very short span of time. And so, yeah, I always knew that there were a few candidates that would do that.
Yeah.
And that goes back to like playlist stuff for me.
Yeah. You mentioned the introduction, and
Mhm.
I want to ask you about something you say there. You write, I think people come to the Memory Palace to feel things rather than learn things. Certainly, that's true for me, and I'm not sure I knew it was true until I read it. I think a part of me always felt like I was kind of failing because I, I've listened to all 200 episodes and I don't think I know anything.
Interesting. You mean like stuff that you can like you just don't know more about history, you mean?
This is just it. Look, this could be a function of like poor working memory of ADHD,
Sure.
which is absolutely a thing, and that I just chase dopamine through
Sure.
podcasts, including the Memory Palace. But it is a fair point that it's that. I think one of the things that I feel when I come to it, and as you said, there's a bunch of feelings people that you're looking to induce by the end. There's an overtone you want to leave ringing in the room
Right.
when you're done. And I agree with that I'm chasing feelings. I can feel outraged sometimes, which is a
Sure.
strange feeling to associate with such a soft
Hmm.
experience. The way you deliver it.
Also, outraged is not something that we usually think about as the past. We're always like, oh, dude, that's effed up.
Yeah.
But you're not like outraged by it. You don't feel it.
Right. There's an immediacy that comes with, I think, the narrative art that you practice, of bringing people in the way one does in fiction. But I wanted to ask that insight of what it's for,
Hmm.
that you're seeking a feeling and not so much teaching. Um, is that something? I guess it's another question of like the timeline of it all. Was that something that's been clear to you for a long time, or were you 120 episodes in before you realized, I think I know what I'm doing here. I'm making people feel things.
No, I think that I think I've known that sort of intuitively, from the beginning, and that it has, the only sort of like epiphanic insight that sort of came in like several episodes in, where there was like a little stretch where I was like, oh, I want to make these things short so that they fit into a national public radio clock. Like the things should be like 5 minutes long because otherwise they're not going to play them.
Hmm.
And also short was fun, and I enjoyed the challenge of short, and you can make a point quickly, you can tell a hilarious joke, you can say a memorable thing quickly. I believed in that. I had written songs and had loved there are so many 3-minute pop songs that have changed my life. So why couldn't I do that? But but as people started to react, what I was noticing was that the things they weren't saying was like, "Oh, wow, that's a fascinating fact." The things they were saying was like, "Oh, wow, I was so moved by that thing, and I remember being moved. I don't necessarily, I barely even, I can pinpoint where I was moved, but I don't know that I remember the context. I can
Mm,
pinpoint both where I was when I heard this, but also what it was about the story of, of the a man owned by George Washington that specifically got me.
mm,
And so, yeah, no, I think that I do think that it is about feelings, both because I want you to feel things. And because I think that if there's any utility, any specific utility for this entertainment that I've created, is that I think of it a little bit of as like it's a thing that can change your day, and I find that changing your day is a very powerful thing. Like I think that things that aren't just background noise, that aren't folding the laundry, accompaniments, all of which are valuable, and I spend an incredible amount of time and pleasurable time, engaging with content like that and engaging with podcasts like that. What I really want to do is I want to sneak into your day and like wake you up a little bit.
mm,
Like wake you up to existence, wake you up to, which is pretentious, but it's true. I mean, that's why I'm writing these stories. I write these stories to connect to the past, to like literally connect myself to this sense of like the wonder of the world, or to the reality of the people around me, which for all its banality and for all its like, it's a difficult thing. Like it is hard to remember. It's the classic thing about remembering that the person in traffic that is driving you crazy because they are weaving in and out of traffic, that you do not know where that person needs to go,
mhm,
and their their desires and their frustrations are just as equal and valid to you. And on some level, like the making you feel things, like, yes, I want to feel you, make you feel things, and move you and whatever. But I'm also like, part of the reason one thing that I have kind of learned over time, 100 episodes in or whatever, is that I actually think that I'm fascinated with feelings. I think that
mm,
part of the reason why these stories work and affect people deeply, when they do, is that feelings are often left out of history. That you are asked to remember facts, and you're asked to like come up with sort of like intellectual understandings about whether it's movements or battles or whatever. And there are some wonderful historians that will remind you that, boy, this person like lived their life in a lot of pain, or that, boy, was it very cold on the day that George Washington crossed the Delaware or whatever. But I actually feel like feelings is where we live. That when you go back and you tell someone you work with, or tell a partner or whatever about your day, and you mention this conversation or whatever, you might say, oh, it was cool to talk to this guy, and you'll explain why it was interesting, or why I was annoying, or whatever it is. But what you will forget to tell is whatever like nervousness you had, or whatever, like all those like sort of spaces that you like don't articulate, the things that are kind of happening, between the narrative poles of our lives, between the plot points in history. That is where we live. That's where we spend our time. That is like, that's consciousness. And I think on some level, I am trying to bring feelings back to our understanding of the past, that like, and in doing so, and like asking you to kind of like imagine what it is like, to be this person in that moment, to connect this person in that moment to your present a little bit. I am asking you to kind of, just sort of like remember that the past is felt just the same as the present does,
mhm.
that these people are just as human as you are. And yeah, like I really am asking, in trying to induce feelings in you, I am trying to understand that feelings is what the game is all about.
It sounds like a concept that David Grann,
Hmm.
the author of Killers of the Flower Moon, the New Yorker writer, who was on this show to talk about,
Shipwreck book. Yeah.
yeah, oh my God, so good. The Wager, what a fantastic book. David Grann talks about kind of his guiding light when he writes is he's trying to situate the reader in the bewildering present.
Yes.
right?
Of the past. Yeah.
Of the past.
I remember reading that thing too. And I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think all of the time about how bewildering the present is, I think that's an excellent word. Um, that like, that even like the simplest thing, like whether the Toronto Raptors should make this trade or that trade, can be debated over and over and over again on local Toronto radio or on ESPN. And, everyone will have their opinion. Everyone will have their set of facts. Everyone will roll out their statistics. And we understand that it is contingent. We understand that, like, these guys don't agree with my position. We will argue our own position. But all of those positions, all of that conversation about something as simple and inconsequential about, whether this guy should get that contract or not and what that number should be, can take up so much time and can take up so much life. And the idea that when we look at the past and we read a book about, even something as simple as some sports event, we forget that all of that conversation and all of that contingency and all of that disagreement and all of that confusion and all of that unsettledness was present then too.
Mm.
That like we always kind of assume that because of our technological sophistication and because of our emotional sophistication and because of that that like, oh, life is just so complex now. And even if it were simpler then, even if one were on a whatever was a cobbler, making shoes for a very small community or something like that, your inner life was just as complicated. Even, there was something else that your brain, was preoccupied with, even if it wasn't what was happening on TikTok, or what was happening, in Raptors Twitter.
Appreciate the local sports references. My heart would truly break if we traded away Boucher and lost our last
Sure.
championship
Exactly.
team member. But that's a separate point. We are living through times of, I think, historical significance, and I know that's like a cliche to say.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's fair to say. Yeah.
Do you see present events sometimes through a memory palace lens? I'm thinking specifically of, as I was preparing for this interview, I just read about Sylvester Turner, who was a congressman and former mayor of Houston. He died during the night after he attended President Trump's joint address. And I thought, that feels like a thing.
Like a future Memory Palace episode, you mean?
If it happened 60 years ago, Nate would have told me about this.
Sure. Yeah, I can see that.
Is that kind of a voice in your head, even as you look at, the current current events?
Like sort of yes and no, like in that, like, to me, like there'd be sort of like a depressing thing if I was looking at, the present, as like future work, that would be depressing. But I do think that this is this lens that yields the Memory Palace. That this process or whatever, is the lens through which I end up seeing everything. And the thing is, a thing that I really do think about is campus protest. I think about this a lot, because, even let's attempt to set politics aside. As people, watch various protests happen, and get outraged, by various things that happen on various sides. And, the thing that I'm utterly convinced of is this thing of like, oh, it has ever been thus, that like every, that like, oh, this is the Toronto Raptors example, with stakes, that it has always been like this. And there was a really formative like event and like kind of like document that helped me understand that, that I don't talk about, that I don't feel like I've talked about before, which is, there's this book called The Strawberry Statement that was written in, I think in 68, 69. And it's basically just sort of like the published, edited diaries of this kid who was tangentially involved in the Columbia protests, anti-Vietnam protests in 1968, and like the building takeovers and stuff like that. And the thing that's fascinating about this book is this slice of life really hit me when I read it at like 19 or 20. Because not only was this kid just like me, he was like literally just like me in that, like, he was not at the center of everything. Like he is not a historical figure except for the fact that he's written this book. He is going to protests sometimes because he is bored. He is going to protests. He goes to multiple. He ends up being a part of some sit-in because there's this same girl that he was hoping he would see there, and she doesn't show up. And there's just something about really understanding that the past, the past. It's that thing about the past is just as unsettled, as the present. That is the lens that I see all this stuff with. That that there is not like I am not one of those people who works in historical field is constantly like, aha, yes, this is just like when this happened on the floor of Congress. This is just like the Treaty of 19 or whatever. I am a person who like looks at the present and mostly like is like, oh, like this tension that you're feeling about why the Democrats won't do this or why or that the tariffs are like this or whatever is happening in that particular week. As time rushes by, this tension that you're feeling is that it's just unsettled, is that we all want these sort of like narrative conclusions, and we want we want to be in the place where there's some sort of coherent narrative and victories declared or whatever it is, but mostly we want coherence. And you can't walk around. You used to be able to walk around being like, I disagree with the mainstream understanding of this, and the mainstream understanding of it is clear to me because there's these three channels that like vaguely tell me the same story. And so you knew where you stood or didn't stand within that with some accuracy. And now that is so difficult. And that I would say is like that is is a condition of the moment. But yeah, I mean, I think that over and over again through these stories, yes, I'm trying to tell you a ripping yarn. Yes, I might be trying to rip your heart out and put it back together or whatever, the kind of like artistic thing. But the kind of like overall intellectual project is always about that thing. And I think I do kind of share with David Grann now that you mention it. I think I am kind of trying to destabilize the past a little bit, and in turn, kind of destabilize your present.
So speaking of the show's relation to the present moment, I have to ask this, which is to say, on the 30th of August, 2024, an orangutan named Kimbali briefly escaped his habitat at the Toronto Zoo.
Sure.
On September 5th, 2024, just a few days later, the Memory Palace released an episode called Ken Allen, all about an orangutan named Ken Allen at the San Diego Zoo who had a reputation for escaping.
Sure.
And I have to know, this is 6 months I've been carrying this burning question with me. Was it a coincidence, or did you write, edit, record, and release?
Total coincidence. No, if that were a 5-day turnaround, that would have been tremendous on my part.
Well, I thought so too.
It was a total no, it was a total coincidence, and I do think that orangutans are probably breaking out more often than we think. But also that was a thing where like weeks later I noticed that news, and I'm like, I didn't even like attempt to like use social media to like make this a news peg or something. I didn't even like attempt to like send this to like, I don't know, the Globe and Mail. So some reporter might be like, oh cool, there's also this guy, which is often a failing on my part, but no, that is a coincidence.
Last question I want to ask you is about the audiobook.
Sure.
Because it's really special. And I imagine it's tricky as someone taking podcast material to turn it into a book and to look at it and think, how am I going to make this an audio thing? Because you've already spent the effort making it an audio thing, and now you have to go make it another one.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you saying it's special. I think so too. Like I feel not only do I feel sort of very proud about it as like a very dedicated, frequent. I mean, honestly, most of my novel consumption is through audiobooks, and so like there has been something very lovely about just even participating in this art form that I enjoy and trying to like figure out like can I push it forward, can I just like make something worthy, make something I would want to listen to.
And so listeners understand, we're talking, when I say it's special, it's because it's eclectic. There's voices. There's tell me about pulling together the audiobook, The Memory Palace.
I think that that early on, I maybe even in my very first sort of sales meeting with the people at Random House was on the Zoom, and we were talking about ways that the books can be, and like things I might want to try, and ways that I might want to use images, and so many of these things that actually like really are there on the page, and I feel very proud about, like what the cover might look like, and it's kind of there. And um, a thing that was really tossed off by them as like a clearly not an open question was like, oh yeah, and then the audiobook's gonna be great because you can read the audiobook. And I said, wait a second. I said, you like, we want to sell this book, to people who love the show and to people who've never heard it. I said, on the one hand, for the person who's never heard it, great. Like, I can read the heck out of a story, no problem. I said, but if we want people who like know these stories, like, won't a new version with like no production and no music, like, won't it just sound like a crappy a cappella version of a song you already like better? And I like, as like a music fan, I'm like, screw that. There's no, it's like, that is not like, I don't want to listen to that. I don't want to subject people to that.
Fake demos.
Yes, like, exactly.
You're doing the demo after the fact.
Totally. There's already like, there was like the active question about like how can we make sure that people, who like the show, like, know that there's enough like new material, and like there's a reason to buy this book, if, and that sort of thing. So like, why should we, how are we going to replicate that same problem in the audiobook? And so I had this idea that I wanted to read, and ultimately more or less came to be that I wanted to read all of the new material myself. I realized I had to read the very first story myself because it'd be weird to like pass that off to someone else. There were a couple little like moments that I wanted to do. And I also figured that I would also read any story that had a particularly strong first person. Like, it's very rare that I use the word I, but I wanted to make sure that I wasn't giving that to someone else to voice, particularly because often the I is there because this story is particularly opinionated or the story is particularly personal. And so why should Ryan Reynolds read that story? And so I, parts of that I thought it would be fun. I thought like it would be cool to have different people read different stories. And, it was a process, both to try to figure out who, but also to kind of like navigate and negotiate with a Random House Audio, like, how many voices they could afford to pay and stuff like that. But there were a couple of things that I think, your listeners and book people will find interesting. One was that my original idea was that if there's like 35 stories or 40 stories that I'm not reading, I wanted 40 readers. And they said, hey, that's going to be annoying to the audience. And I think they might have been right. And so I said, so let's get some people who read multiple. And like, okay, that's cool. And then one of the people I mentioned was a dear friend of mine, Rebecca Lohman, who might be literally my favorite audiobook reader. And she just happens to be a friend of mine. And they're like, hey, you have Rebecca Lohman on this thing. If you can get her, that means you might be able to get like this person and this person. And the thing you're not realizing, as you set out this plan for your audiobook, is that there's like several hundred people, which is not nothing, who will just buy this book and download this book Rebecca's reading. So if we can spread that out over like 3 people and they read like a few stories each, then suddenly like that's going to help. And I was like, great. And they said, who's your favorite, who's your, like, name some other readers. And I listed some readers and they're like, oh, let's check out this guy. And so next thing I know, I have 3 people in there who I love having in my ears already. But then it also became about the other people I love having in my ears. And that is, people I love from podcasts, people I know, like Avery Trufelman, who does a podcast called Articles of Interest, has one of my very favorite voices in the world. And she's also a dear friend. And so the idea of both having this like wonderful voice that I guess professionally, someone might be excited that, oh, Avery reads a story. But to me, it's that Avery reads a story. And I love Avery and I love her voice. And I love having my friend Latif Nasser, who's a host of Radio Lab and who I had lunch with like 3 days ago. It's meaningful to me to have his voice in there. It's meaningful to me to have my daughter's voice at 15 read the story that she loved when she was a little kid. And the fact that she is now 16 is not lost on me. And then there were these handful of celebrities who I happened to just notice like through the internet over time, were like this, like the show. And at one point when I was trying to get Random House to like spend some extra money, which they were loath to do, I was like, what if I could get And I was like, who's my most famous Twitter follower? I'm like, what if I could get Ryan Reynolds? And they're like, that would be cool. And then DM'd him, and much to my surprise and delight, 5 minutes later, he DM'd me and said, yeah, I'd like to do that once they finish this Deadpool stuff.
Well, I hope the Memory Palace goes on forever, Nate. I hope someone far in the future writes a Memory Palace like thing about your show and the wonder of it all.
That's kind of you. I think that part of the delight of having a book and having an audiobook is both it's finding new audiences and stuff like that, but it is also it's like, it's hard on some level. It's hard to imagine how, because we just don't know, like, whether podcasts will be a thing in the future, whether they will live on in some historical capacity, whether they will be, a flash in the pan or some vital thing, whether people will, listen to, the works of Roman Mars and 99% Invisible or Mark Maron, in the same way that they might listen to, like, I don't know, an Ella Fitzgerald record. I have no idea. But there is just something nice about, something powerful to me about having a book that can sit on a shelf and be, discovered by, not only, discovered by other readers, or even just like left behind in a hotel and picked up again. Mm-hmm. There's something really powerful to me personally about, participating in that, practice, in that tradition that I love so much.
Thanks for joining us, Nate.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here.
I have been speaking with Nate DiMeo, author of The Memory Palace. Find it and all the books we spoke about at Kobo and Conversation's home on the web. That's kobo.com/conversation. There's a link in the show notes. That's why it's easy. Follow the show wherever you listen so you don't miss an episode. And if you enjoyed this one, tell somebody who you share some history with. Kobo and Conversation is produced, hosted, and edited this week by me, Nathan Maharaj. Thank you for listening.